today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell.
I thought today we'd tackle this subject as well, because it's a question that comes up time and time again, whether I'm looking after people in family court and there's a domestic violence theme running through the case, or whether I'm working with one of my clients in our counselling business. The question, doesn't matter how you phrase it, but the question time and time again is, if you are suffering at the hands of domestic violence, why did you stay?
I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor.
And that's true. But then the question is, what does a typical domestic violence survivor look like? Domestic violence is rife in all walks of life. It's not about social status. It's not about wealth. It's not about religion. It's not about geographics. It is in every walk of life. It's in every street, in every town, here in the United Kingdom, and indeed in the US, where Leslie's delivering this video.
I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me.
Let's just stop there for a minute, because Leslie perhaps skirted over that point. It's important to note that domestic abuse does primarily affect women, but having said that, there is also a significant proportion of men who are victims of domestic violence and victims of domestic abuse. Men who find themselves in relationships which they surmised when they moved into the relationship to be a loving, caring, compassionate relationship. And it turns out that they actually become victims of violence or victims of psychological or emotional abuse. And because of the psyche of men, that is awfully hard to admit. It is awfully hard to raise amongst your mates, among your friends, the fact that you're, as a man, that you're a victim of domestic abuse. In some respects more challenging than making that admission as a woman.
But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages.
And I'll just interject there to say, here in the United Kingdom, that age range, that 16 to 24 age range, pretty much applies here too, for the women who find themselves as the most susceptible to victims of domestic violence.
And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners.
Now, the 500 figure applies to the United States. Here in the UK, approaching 150 deaths every year are attributable to partners or former partners as incidents of domestic violence leading to death.
Boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very...
But let's think about that just for a minute. So Leslie just told us that in the United States, with a population of 330-ish million people, that around 500 people are killed every year as a result of domestic violence. Here in the UK, with a population of around 68 million, about 150 people are killed every year as a result of domestic violence. So if we look at that as a proportion, what we're effectively saying in the United States, 1 in every 662,000 people is at risk of being killed as a result of domestic violence. And that's a frightening figure. But if we relate that to the United Kingdom, here in the United Kingdom, 1 in every 453,000 people is likely to be a victim of domestic violence. So by virtue of that, what we're saying is that domestic violence as a fatal incident is more prevalent here in the UK than it is in the United States, and that's a frightening thought.
Very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me.
Often the first signs of a potentially domestically violent, domestically abusive relationship is the fact that the partner idolizes the other one, that they just cannot do enough for them, that they strive to make the world revolve around them. And that's a warning sign. Now, let's not take that in every instance where one partner idolizes the other. Let's not assume that every time that is going to lead to domestic violence or a domestically abusive relationship. But it is a very clear indicator, and it's a very clear indicator of narcissistic behavior.
We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me.
He wanted to know everything about me, about my family, about my hopes and my dreams, and about my childhood. Why? Why? Because information is power. Because by knowing about you, because by knowing where you've come from, by knowing where you hope to go, that partner can begin the coercive control, can begin the manipulation that ultimately is going to lead to abuse and violence.
Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather.
Again, very typical approach used by domestic abusers is that they present themselves as vulnerable, they present themselves as damaged in order that you feel sorry for them, in order that you sympathise and you empathise with them, and in order that you take the first steps towards starting to forgive the behaviour that's going to come.
And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you.
And that's where we're headed. That's where this relationship that Leslie is talking about, and every domestic abuse and domestically violent relationship is heading. It's heading towards control. It's heading towards manipulation. It's heading towards, it's you and me against the world, and I need, as the abuser, I need to control the circumstances. I need to control the narrative in order to keep us safe. It's in your best interests that you submit to my control.
Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim.
So what we're saying there is we seduce and we charm. We put the victim, and let's use that term. We put the victim in the center of the world. They're the most important thing, the most important person that we have in our lives. That's the first thing we do, because what we're doing there is we're sugarcoating them. We're creating the illusion that they are precious, that they're on a pedestal, that they're a princess. The next stage is we then need to move them outside their network, outside the secure network that they have in their lives. And that is about isolation that Leslie's just talking about here.
Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together.
Because you make sacrifices for your soulmate. That is the level of control that this individual, in Leslie's scenario, and indeed in every domestic violence and domestic abuse scenario, the level of control that they already have, that you will make sacrifices, you will make decisions that have little or no rationale to them because you've been told to.
The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe, he bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times.
Now, thankfully, here in the UK, guns are not quite as readily as available. So thankfully, possibly, we haven't got that degree of threat. But in terms of domestic abuse and domestic violence in the UK, it's not unusual for the abuser, for the perpetrator, to arm themselves. It can be with knives, it can be with bats, it can be with weaponry of that type. And they say it is in order to keep you safe. They say that the reason that they are arming themselves is to keep you safe.
Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding.
I'm just going to stop that there for a minute because that reminds me of a client who was involved with us a couple of years ago. A lady who came to us in order to try and organise a family law matter because she was trying to sort out her children. But she had been in a domestically abusive relationship. And whilst sitting with me one afternoon describing the situation to me, she talked about her wedding day. And she talked about the fact that her wedding day, which, we all believe and we all want to be the happiest day of our life, hers was, well, the way it was described to me, hers was an absolute nightmare. Her soon-to-be husband arrived in the room where she was getting dressed. She was on her own. And he arrived in the room, and first he sexually assaulted her because he believed that was his right. Having done that, she put the dress on, and I'm sure she looked beautiful. But she put the dress on. He decided he didn't like the dress very much, but he knew full well that he couldn't hit her in the face. He couldn't hit her around the shoulders because that would be seen by the other wedding guests. So what he did instead was he kicked her repeatedly around the top of her thighs, and he kicked her repeatedly in the stomach in order that she was black and blue, but underneath a white dress.
It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry.
They always are. Abusers always are. After the event, they are always very, very sorry, and it will never happen again. Here in the United Kingdom last year, in 2021, there were 1.4 million reported incidents to the police of domestic violence. 1.4 million incidents. Of those, some 215,000 revolved around stalking and harassment, but a lot of them were exceedingly violent crime. The Office of National Statistics, who do a crime survey every year, they suggest that in the 2021 survey, around 2.3 million people in this country had experienced domestic violence. They're pretty frightening numbers. They're pretty sobering numbers. But remember that after every incident, they're always sorry.
He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon.
It's always going to happen again. After the first time, when you condoned it by accepting it, by allowing it to be brushed under the carpet because he was or she was very, very sorry, at that very moment, what you are doing is you are opening the floodgates to it happening again and again and again, because you have allowed that behaviour to exist within your relationship, be it your marriage or be it a cohabiting relationship. You've allowed it to exist by virtue of the fact that you've accepted it, and you haven't walked away the first time you were a victim of violence or abuse.
I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that...
Let's just give you some UK numbers there. Leslie's just told us that 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence at some point in their life. Here in the UK, we report that as 1 in 4 women suffer domestic violence at some point in their life. And Leslie's about to go on to say, which we'll hear in a sec, that reportedly 15 million children in the United States have been victims of domestic violence. Here in the UK, we can take figures, we can stab at figures, but the reality is, we don't know. And the US figure of 15 million, it's a guess, it's a best guess, because obviously, if it's not reported, how could we ever know? So there could be hundreds of thousands of children in this country who are victims of domestic violence. There could be millions.
15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons.
And how many times have I heard that? How many times in family law cases and in counselling cases have I heard the victim effectively tell me that it was their fault and effectively tell me that it was their mission to work with their partner who was, to use Leslie's phrase, who was troubled by demons? It's not. If you're suffering at the hands of domestic abuse or at the hands of domestic violence, it's not your fault. And it's not your job to have to fix the abuser.
The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask. Because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser. Because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother.
That's true. That is very true. In so many of the family law cases that we've been involved in over the years, we have found that the court has awarded contact to the abuser, be that father or be that mother, and they've awarded them to have contact with their children, despite the fact that those children have witnessed the most horrendous, the most heinous acts. But the court still believes that it's appropriate for those children to be presented back to the abuser because it's in the best interests of parenting for children to have contact with both of their parents. Well, I'm sorry, but if the parent is an abuser, if the parent beat their partner, be it their husband or their wife, surely that parent loses their right to be regarded as a responsible, acceptable parent.
We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying. As if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me, because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab, and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves.
And I'm just going to echo that, because watching this video now, there will be, and maybe it's you, who are victims of abuse or victims of domestic violence, either in the past or now, currently, today, right now. Or you're the abuser, you're the perpetrator, you're the individual, be it a man or a woman, who believes it is appropriate and justified for you to coerce and manipulate and control with violence another human being. It's not. It's not an appropriate thing to do. It's not a right thing to do. You have no right to do that. If you're the abuser, reach out and get some help to solve the psychological issues that are leading to you presenting this behavior. If you are being abused, reach out.
Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now.
Or your husband, your brother, or your best friend.
I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it.
And that's where we're going to leave Leslie's video, and she's absolutely right. The only way, as a society, we will break the evil that is domestic violence is by shining a light on it, and is by talking about it. And where we become aware of it is by illuminating that episode, illuminating that situation, in order that the victim can be extracted, that the victim can get out, and the abuser can be attended to. The abuser can be brought to pay, and the abuser can be brought to justice. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that interesting, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to learn more about Daniel Picave Counselling, watch that video. If you want to learn more about McKenzie Picave Family Law, watch that video. And remember to subscribe, because 68% of you haven't. See you next time.